By December 1944, Germany was losing the war at a speed its leadership had not fully absorbed. In the West, Allied forces had broken out of Normandy, crossed France in a rapid pursuit, and were now pressed against Germany's borders. Paris had been liberated in August. Brussels fell in early September. Antwerp, Europe's most important port, was captured intact on 4th of September, though its approaches were still contested. To Berlin, the Western Front no longer looked like a flexible defense. It looked like a slow suffocation. Yet the Allied advance carried its own weaknesses. Supply lines stretched hundreds of kilometers back to the Normandy beaches. Fuel shortages had repeatedly forced U.S. armored units to halt in September. Infantry divisions were spread thin along a long, irregular front from the North Sea to Switzerland. Many American units were newly arrived, understrength, or resting after heavy fighting. The Ardennes sector, in particular, was considered quiet. Its dense forests, narrow roads, and poor winter weather made it unsuitable, so Allied planners believed, for major offensive action. As a result, it was held by a patchwork of divisions, some experienced, others green, with minimal armored reserves close at hand. Germany's situation was far worse. On the Eastern Front, Soviet forces were paused only briefly, refitting for an offensive that would soon smash into East Prussia and Poland. In the air, the Luftwaffe had lost air superiority permanently. Pilot training hours had collapsed. Fuel shortages grounded entire fighter wings. On the ground, German divisions were shadows of their 1941 or even 1943 strength. Infantry battalions were underfilled. Artillery ammunition was rationed. Fuel was the most critical constraint of all. Germany no longer had the oil to sustain mobile warfare for long. Despite this, Adolf Hitler rejected a purely defensive strategy. He believed Germany could still force a political collapse among the Western Allies. His reasoning rested on several assumptions. First, he believed the United States and Britain were war-weary and politically fragile. Second, he believed a dramatic defeat inflicted on U.S. forces could fracture the Anglo-American alliance. Third, he believed that by capturing Antwerp and cutting off Allied armies in northern Belgium and the Netherlands, Germany could force a negotiated peace in the West, freeing forces to face the Soviet Union. These assumptions ignored the reality of Allied industrial power and political resolve, but they shaped every decision that followed. The result was a plan that concentrated almost everything Germany still had that could move. In late 1944, Germany quietly rebuilt a strategic reserve. This was done by stripping other fronts. Units were pulled from the Netherlands, from the Siegfried Line, even from the Eastern Front. New Volksgrenadier divisions were formed by combining veterans, convalescents, Luftwaffe ground crews, and naval personnel. Armored formations were refitted, with the last production runs of Panthers, Panzerpfeifers, and Tiger IIs. Fuel was hoarded for months, hidden from routine distribution, reserved for a single blow. The choice of the Ardennes was deliberate. The terrain limited Allied air power in winter weather. The road network, while poor, channeled movement in predictable directions. Most importantly, Allied intelligence believed the area incapable of supporting a large-scale offensive. German planners intended to exploit that belief fully. Surprise was essential. Radio silence was enforced. Troop movements were conducted at night. Deception measures suggested defensive preparations elsewhere. Strategically, the offensive was a gamble rooted in desperation. Germany no longer possessed the capacity for sustained operations. It could not replace heavy losses. It could not maintain momentum once fuel ran low. What it could still do, briefly, was concentrate force. The Ardennes plan was not designed for attrition. It was designed for shock. Break the front, seize the Meuse crossings, capture Antwerp. Force political consequences before military reality caught up. The risk was obvious even to German commanders. The distances were long. The roads were few. The weather was unpredictable. The Allied response, once mobilized, would be overwhelming. But for Hitler, delay meant inevitable defeat. The strategic situation before the offensive was therefore defined by imbalance. Allied strength growing daily, German strength shrinking irreversibly. The Ardennes offensive was not a sign of German resurgence. It was an admission that time itself had become the enemy. The German plan for the Ardennes offensive was not a limited counterattack. It was a full-scale strategic gamble that demanded precision, speed, and resources Germany no longer truly possessed. Officially named Unternehmen Wacht am Rhein, Operation Watch on the Rhine, the plan aimed to achieve what months of defensive fighting had failed to do: shatter Allied cohesion in the West with a single, decisive blow. At its core, the plan required three conditions to be met simultaneously. First, German forces had to achieve complete tactical surprise. Second, armored spearheads had to advance faster than Allied command, and logistics could react. Third, fuel captured from Allied depots had to sustain the offensive beyond Germany's own limited reserves. If any of these conditions failed, the operation would collapse. The operational design divided the attacking force into three main armies. In the north, the 6th Panzer Army, commanded by Sepp Dietrich, was assigned the decisive role. It was to break through U.S. lines, cross the Meuse River, and drive directly toward Antwerp. This formation included Germany's most powerful remaining armored units, including SS Panzer divisions equipped with Panther and Tiger the Super tanks. Hitler personally favored this army and expected it to deliver the political knockout blow. In the center, the 5th Panzer Army under Hasso von Manteuffel was tasked with advancing through the most difficult terrain. Its objective was to seize critical road junctions and river crossings, enabling the northern thrust to continue westward. This force would do much of the fighting in the Ardennes' narrow valleys and forested hills, where maneuver was restricted and logistics fragile. To the south, the 7th Army provided flank protection. Its role was defensive in nature, preventing American forces from launching counterattacks from the south that could cut off the advancing panzer columns. Though weaker than the panzer armies, it was essential to maintaining the integrity of the offensive. In total, Germany committed over 200,000 troops to the initial assault, supported by approximately 200 tanks and assault guns, and nearly 1,000 aircraft reserved for the opening phase. This represented a staggering concentration of force, given Germany's overall condition in late 1944. Many of these units were pulled from quiet sectors or reconstituted hastily. Some divisions existed only on paper weeks earlier. The infantry backbone of the offensive consisted largely of newly formed Volksgrenadier divisions. These units were smaller than standard infantry divisions, but carried a high density of automatic weapons, such as the Sturmgewehr 44, intended to maximize firepower in close terrain. While some Volksgrenadier units contained experienced veterans, others were filled with teenagers, older men, and personnel transferred from the Luftwaffe and Kriegsmarine with minimal infantry training. Their effectiveness varied widely. Armor was the offensive's critical striking arm, but it also represented its greatest vulnerability. German tanks were tactically formidable, particularly the Panther and Tiger II, but they were fuel-hungry, maintenance-intensive, and ill-suited to icy roads and narrow forest tracks. Breakdown rates were high even before combat began. Recovery vehicles were scarce. A disabled tank often became a permanent loss. Fuel planning bordered on fantasy. German calculations assumed that captured Allied fuel dumps would sustain the advance after the first few days. In reality, this required rapid overruns of specific supply areas and intact depots, events that depended on perfect timing and minimal resistance. Any delay would strand armored units far from their starting points, immobile and exposed. Secrecy was enforced ruthlessly. Radio silence limited coordination, but reduced detection. Orders were distributed late to avoid leaks. Even senior commanders were informed of the full scope only shortly before the attack. Deception efforts suggested defensive intentions along the Rhine, reinforcing Allied assumptions that Germany lacked the strength for offensive action. The timetable was unforgiving. German planners expected to reach the Meuse within 4 days and Antwerp within 10. This pace left no margin for error. Weather was expected to ground Allied aircraft for the opening phase, but once skies cleared, German columns would be highly vulnerable to air attack. Every hour mattered. The plan's most dangerous flaw lay not in its conception, but in its premise. It assumed that German forces could still operate as a coordinated, fast-moving instrument of war. In reality, they were an instrument already cracking under strain. The Ardennes offensive committed Germany's last operational reserves, men, tanks, fuel, and aircraft, in a single roll of the dice. Once spent, nothing remained behind them. At 05:30 hours on 16th of December 1944, the Ardennes erupted. More than 1,000 German artillery pieces opened fire along an 80-kilometer front, their shells tearing into American positions that had not expected a major attack. The bombardment was brief by Eastern Front standards, but precisely targeted. Communications centers, artillery batteries, and command posts were hit first. In many sectors, telephone lines were severed within minutes. Radio nets were sparse by design, leaving units blind and isolated as the infantry assault followed. German troops advanced through fog, snow, and forest. Visibility was often measured in meters. In several sectors, American forward observers could not see beyond their own positions. This environment favored infiltration tactics. German assault units bypassed strong points, slipped through wooded gaps, and struck rear areas before frontline units understood what was happening. The effect was confusion rather than collapse, but confusion at the wrong time was deadly. The main breakthroughs came where the U.S. line was thinnest. In the north, elements of the 6th Panzer Army struck American divisions that were either inexperienced or refitting. In the Losheim Gap, German infantry and armor punched through a seam between units, opening one of the most important corridors of the offensive. Roads that Allied planners had treated as secondary suddenly became arteries for German movement. In the center, the 5th Panzer Army achieved some of its most dangerous successes. German units overran regimental headquarters, captured supply dumps, and seized road junctions critical to lateral movement. Entire American battalions were surrounded or forced to withdraw without orders. In the first 48 hours, some U.S. divisions lost cohesion not because they were destroyed, but because their command structures were fragmented. The psychological shock was immediate. For months, Allied troops had been advancing. Now they were falling back, often under pressure, through unfamiliar terrain in winter conditions. Reports reaching higher headquarters were contradictory. Some units reported massive armored formations where only small groups existed. Others underestimated German strength entirely. This uncertainty slowed decision-making at precisely the moment speed mattered most. German armored spearheads advanced rapidly where roads allowed. Panthers and Panzer IVs rolled past burning villages and abandoned American vehicles. In several cases, German columns captured fuel and rations intact, briefly validating the offensive's most optimistic assumptions. U.S. gasoline, food, and winter clothing were seized, and immediately redistributed to advancing units. However, the breakthrough was uneven. For every sector where German forces advanced 10 or 20 kilometers, there were others where progress stalled almost immediately. American artillery, once brought into action, inflicted heavy losses on attacking infantry. Isolated U.S. units fought delaying actions that disrupted German timetables. Small roadblocks, often manned by engineers or rear echelon troops, forced panzer columns to deploy, costing hours they could not afford. One of the most critical moments occurred around St. Vith. This road hub was essential to German movement toward the Meuse. American forces, though outnumbered, held the area longer than expected, forcing German units to detour and compress their advance into fewer roads. The delay at St. Vith would later prove decisive, though its significance was not immediately apparent. Weather initially worked in Germany's favor. Low clouds and fog grounded Allied tactical air power, denying the Americans one of their greatest advantages. For the first days of the offensive, German columns moved largely unmolested from the air. This window was brief, but it was enough to deepen the salient that would soon be known as the Bulge. By 18th of December, the shape of the battle had emerged. The German advance had created a deep penetration into the Allied line, bending it westward but failing to break it entirely. American forces were retreating, but they were not disintegrating. Importantly, German losses were already mounting, especially among infantry units forced to clear forests and villages without adequate artillery support. The initial breakthrough succeeded in its narrowest objective: surprise. It disrupted Allied plans, forced emergency responses, and temporarily restored German operational initiative. But it failed to achieve the decisive rupture required for long-term success. German units were advancing, but not fast enough. Fuel consumption exceeded projections. Road congestion increased with every kilometer gained. The offensive was still alive, but it was already behind schedule. By the third day of the Ardennes offensive, the battle's center of gravity had shifted from firepower to fuel. German units were still advancing in places, but the structure supporting that advance was beginning to fail. The offensive had been planned as a race against time, and time was now turning against Germany. The Ardennes road network was the first constraint to bite. Most routes were narrow, winding, and surfaced poorly. Snow, ice, and damaged bridges slowed movement even further. German planners had assumed rapid breakthroughs would open multiple axes of advance, but resistance at key junctions compressed traffic onto fewer roads. The result was congestion on a scale that paralyzed entire divisions. Long columns of tanks, half-tracks, artillery, and supply vehicles stretched for kilometers, bumper to bumper. Engines idling and burning irreplaceable fuel. Fuel shortages were immediate and severe. German armored divisions had begun the offensive with only enough fuel for a few days of operations. Every kilometer driven without capturing Allied fuel dumps worsened the problem. In several instances, panzer units were forced to halt within sight of their objectives, immobilized not by enemy fire, but by empty tanks. Vehicles were abandoned where they stood, often blocking roads and further worsening congestion. Breakdowns compounded the crisis. Panther and Tiger II tanks were powerful but mechanically fragile, especially in winter conditions. Final drives failed. Engines overheated or froze. Tracks snapped on icy roads. Recovery vehicles were scarce and under constant time pressure. Disabled tanks were frequently destroyed by their own crews to prevent capture. These losses were permanent. Germany no longer had the industrial or logistical capacity to replace them. As delays mounted, the weather changed. Around 23 December, skies cleared across much of the Ardennes. Allied air power returned with overwhelming effect. Fighter bombers struck German columns, bridges, and supply areas relentlessly. Roads became killing zones by daylight. Even limited movement drew immediate attack. German troops adapted by moving at night and hiding vehicles during the day, but this further slowed the advance and consumed precious fuel without gaining ground. The Luftwaffe could offer little protection. Its fighter units were depleted, short of trained pilots, and critically low on fuel. Sortie rates were minimal compared to Allied output. Where German aircraft did appear, they were heavily outnumbered. The air war over the Ardennes was brief and decisive, and it belonged entirely to the Allies once weather permitted. Command and control also began to fracture. Radio silence, essential for surprise, now hindered coordination. Units outran their orders. Boundaries between divisions blurred. Some commanders advanced aggressively without knowing the situation on their flanks. Others halted unnecessarily, awaiting instructions that could not arrive in time. The fog of war, initially an advantage, now worked against the attackers. German overreach became visible on the map. The offensive bulge deepened, but its shoulders remained strong. American forces, though pushed back, held key high ground and road hubs. German spearheads were increasingly exposed, extending farther west without secure supply lines behind them. Every additional kilometer increased vulnerability. Captured Allied fuel dumps did provide temporary relief in some sectors, but never at the scale required. Supplies were scattered, often sabotaged or destroyed during fighting. Distribution was chaotic. A unit might seize thousands of liters of fuel, but lack the trucks to move it forward. In some cases, German troops drank captured American rations, while their tanks sat idle nearby, dry. The most damaging effect of the logistics collapse was not immediate loss of territory, but loss of tempo. The offensive depended on speed to prevent Allied reaction. Once momentum slowed, the initiative shifted. American commanders began moving reserves. Roadblocks turned into defensive lines. What had been a fluid advance hardened into a series of costly, localized fights. Exactly the kind of battle Germany could no longer afford. By late December, the German advance had effectively culminated. Units still fought fiercely, but the operational dream of reaching the Meuse, let alone Antwerp, was gone. The offensive had burned through fuel, equipment, and manpower at a rate that far exceeded any possible gain. The collapse was not dramatic. There was no single moment of defeat. Instead, the attack suffocated under its own weight. Germany had committed its last mobile reserves to an operation that could not sustain itself. Once fuel, time, and momentum were lost, recovery was impossible. The Ardennes offensive had overreached its logistical reality. From this point onward, the battle was no longer about German advance. It was about German survival. Once the German offensive lost momentum, the character of the battle changed decisively. What had begun as a surprise penetration now became a test of endurance. And in that test, the Allies held every structural advantage. The critical shift occurred not because the Germans stopped fighting, but because the Allies regained control of time, movement, and coordination. American high command reacted faster than German planners had expected. Within days, reserves were moving toward the Ardennes from every direction. The most significant maneuver came from the south. The U.S. Third Army, already positioned for operations elsewhere, executed a rapid operational pivot. Units were rerouted, axes of advance reversed, and supply priorities shifted under winter conditions that punished every mile of movement. This maneuver was not improvised at the last moment. It was the result of a command system capable of rapid decision-making once the threat was understood. Bastogne became the focal point of the central sector. The town was not important for its buildings or terrain, but for its roads. 7 major routes converged there. German plans required Bastogne to be taken quickly. Instead, American forces held it under encirclement. Cut off, short of supplies, and under constant attack, the defenders tied down German units that could not be spared. Every day Bastogne held was a day German timetables unraveled further. While the siege drew attention, Allied containment extended far beyond it. On the northern shoulder of the Bulge, American units stabilized the line and prevented German forces from widening the penetration. This was strategically decisive. A narrow salient could be counterattacked. A broad rupture might have been fatal. German units repeatedly attempted to break through these shoulders and failed, losing men and vehicles they could not replace. By late December, Allied air power returned in full force. Clear skies transformed the battlefield. German movement by daylight became nearly impossible. Supply routes were attacked continuously. Isolated units found themselves without fuel, ammunition, or communications. The air-ground coordination displayed by Allied forces contrasted sharply with German fragmentation. Tactical airstrikes were directed against specific choke points, bridges, and road junctions, amplifying the effects of the logistics collapse already underway. The Allied counterattack was methodical rather than dramatic. There was no reckless dash forward. Units advanced deliberately, supported by artillery concentrations that overwhelmed German defensive positions. American artillery, in particular, proved decisive. Fire missions were coordinated across multiple divisions, creating zones of destruction that German infantry could not cross without severe losses. Ammunition stocks, unlike Germany's, were effectively unlimited. British forces also played a stabilizing role, particularly in the north. Though less engaged in the initial fighting, they anchored sectors that allowed American units to concentrate elsewhere. This coalition coordination denied Germany any opportunity to exploit gaps between Allied armies, one of Hitler's central assumptions. German units attempted local counterattacks, but these actions lacked coherence. Fuel shortages limited mobility. Infantry units were exhausted and understrength. Armored formations, once the spearhead of the offensive, were now committed piecemeal to defensive fights they were never designed to fight. Each engagement drained Germany further without altering the strategic picture. By early January 1945, the initiative had fully shifted. Allied forces attacked from multiple directions, compressing the Bulge and threatening encirclement of forward German units. Withdrawal became inevitable, but retreat under Allied air and artillery pressure was costly. Vehicles abandoned during the advance now blocked routes back. Bridges destroyed earlier to slow Allied pursuit also trapped German units on the wrong side of rivers and valleys. The counterattack did not merely regain lost ground. It destroyed the remaining combat effectiveness of German formations involved in the offensive. Divisions that withdrew did so with a fraction of their starting strength. Command structures were shattered. Equipment losses were irreplaceable. The Ardennes fighting ended not with a single climactic battle, but with a steady erosion of German capability until resistance could no longer be sustained. By mid-January, the front had largely returned to its pre-offensive position. The terrain looked familiar again. The balance of power, however, was not. The Allies had absorbed the shock and emerged stronger. Germany had spent what it could never replace. When the Ardennes fighting finally subsided in late January 1945, the front lines looked deceptively familiar. Much of the territory gained by Germany in December had been retaken. Villages returned to Allied control. Road junctions reopened. On the surface, the battle appeared to end where it began. Strategically, however, the outcome could not have been more different. The Ardennes offensive had destroyed Germany's last operational reserve in the West. The human cost was severe. German casualties are estimated at roughly 80,000 to 100,000 men, including killed, wounded, missing, and captured. For an army already scraping manpower from teenagers and older men, these losses were catastrophic. Many of the casualties were experienced soldiers pulled from other fronts to form the offensive corps. Their loss hollowed out divisions that could not be rebuilt. Material losses were even more decisive. Germany lost approximately 600 to 700 tanks and assault guns during the battle. These were not obsolete vehicles. They included Panthers, Panzerfoes, and Tiger IIs, machines that represented the peak of German armored production. Each loss was permanent. By early 1945, German factories could not replace heavy armor at anything close to the rate required, even before Allied bombing further degraded production. The Luftwaffe suffered losses that accelerated its collapse. Aircraft destroyed in the Ardennes and in the subsequent failed air operations drained already depleted pilot cadres. Fuel shortages meant surviving planes often remained grounded. After January 1945, the Luftwaffe ceased to function as a coherent defensive force in the West. Allied air supremacy became absolute. Perhaps most critically, the battle consumed Germany's last mobile formations. Panzer divisions that survived did so in name only. Vehicles were gone. Trained crews were dead or captured. Command staffs were fragmented. These units could no longer conduct offensive or even elastic defensive operations. What remained of German forces in the West was largely static. Infantry formations incapable of rapid maneuver. The strategic consequences were immediate. When Allied armies resumed their advance into Germany in February and March 1945, they encountered resistance, but not operational counterattacks. The Rhine crossings faced local opposition, not mobile reserves. Once Allied forces broke through, there was nothing left to seal the gaps. The road to the Ruhr, Germany's industrial heartland, lay open. Equally important was the psychological effect on German command. The Ardennes offensive had been the last attempt to impose strategic surprise and initiative. Its failure confirmed what many commanders already knew but could not openly state. Germany could no longer shape events. From this point onward, German operations were reactive, fragmented, and increasingly disconnected from reality. For the Allies, the battle validated the resilience of their command systems. Units had been surprised, pushed back, and battered, but not destroyed. Logistics absorbed the shock. Artillery and air power compensated for early dislocation. Reserves moved where needed. The ability to lose ground temporarily without losing the war proved decisive. In hindsight, the Ardennes offensive did not delay Germany's defeat in any meaningful way. Instead, it accelerated it. By committing its last reserves in a single, unsustainable gamble, Germany ensured that no meaningful defense could be mounted afterward. The Western Front became a one-way advance toward the Rhine, the Ruhr, and ultimately Berlin. The Battle of the Bulge was therefore not Germany's last hope, as it is sometimes portrayed. It was its last expenditure. After January 1945, Germany still possessed soldiers, weapons, and territory, but it no longer possessed options. The war in the West was decided not by the capture of a city, but by the destruction of the ability to resist in depth. This is why the Ardennes matters, not because it almost succeeded, but because of what it consumed. Men who could not be replaced. Tanks that could not be rebuilt. Fuel that could never be regained. The offensive did not break the Allies. It broke Germany's capacity to fight a modern war. If you want more deep, battle-focused breakdowns like this, no myths, no fluff, just how wars are actually decided. Subscribe to www.2 Battles. New battles, real numbers, and the moments where entire armies were spent forever.